I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the GoldMoney Foundation, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning with Philipp Vorndran of Flossbach von Storch, a money management firm here in Germany. Philipp, thank you for joining me this morning. Looking forward to speaking to you about all of the things that are going on. Let's start with the euro and your views. You know, there's some issues that have been developing with regard to Greek. How do you see this playing out over the next few months?
Yeah, it's not really a surprise for us. We started in 2008, 2009, traveling to Greece, checking their number, doing the real hardcore number crunching, and we made a lot of interviews in 2009 that Greece is going to go bankrupt in 2010, and it would be a great chance for the nation to leave the euro. And it would be in the very best interest of the citizens of Greece.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that, it's not only about the solvency, the liquidity problem, the competitiveness is the real question they are facing. And even if we make the haircut, which we think is the obvious next step, then the issue is still not solved.
Can the German banks afford the haircut?
They can afford the haircut. If it would be only Greece, it wouldn't be an issue. A lot of people always challenge me and argue, Philipp, why are you so worried about 2 or 3% of Eurozone GDP? That's not really relevant, but relevant are 360 billion euros of debt. But in general, we think the biggest portion of this debt is already with the ECB, via the Greece banks and the banks in Cyprus. And I think the German and French financial institutions would be able to handle that. If one or two run into a solvency risk, then the German government has to nationalize them. And I hope this time they will make it more prudent, more the way the US did it than Germany did it the first time.
Well, we've had 3 countries now in Europe on the ropes, Greece, Ireland, and more recently Portugal. I guess the bigger issue is what happens to perhaps Spain or perhaps even Italy. You know, Spain itself is twice, if you add Ireland, Greece, and Portugal together, Spain is twice the economy. What if something were to happen with Spain and it goes into a liquidity or debt crisis similar to these other countries?
Yeah, you are spot on. And that's the reason we traveled to Spain. Just 10 days ago, we met with a lot of institutions there, with the finance ministry, with the big real estate companies, with investors, with unionists, and purely men and women in the street to check, is there any kind of black swan risk in Spain close to us within the next months? We were very nervous when we traveled to Spain. We came back a bit more relaxed. We don't see a major risk with the private banks. They are much better capitalized than, for example, the private banks in Germany. There is a risk with the cajas.
Yes.
We would assume it's around 80 to 100 billion euros.
Which is much bigger than the Spanish government has
definitely, but still the Spanish economy would be able to take that to its balance sheet. They have around 80% debt to GDP. They would come to levels close to the US if they had to. But short term, we don't think there is a liquidity and solvency risk. The much more difficult issue we think Spain will face is competitiveness going further on and their business model. Because Spain still, in terms of labor cost, is too expensive to attract international companies. And it's not all about tourism, especially if you have Greece devaluing and being much harder competitive structure on the tourism side. So short term, we are a little bit more relaxed. Medium term, the jury is still open. And obviously, we are also taking very close eye to countries like Belgium and Italy, which are the next one we have to travel, and the UK.
Yeah, Belgium's particularly interesting given the political impasse that we have there and the seeming unwillingness to resolve the political question. If you can't resolve the political question, what about the huge debt that Belgium is carrying? It's a real question mark, I think, that has to be resolved.
Yeah, to some extent, I think for the country, it's even better to have no government. If you have no government, nobody's there to increase the debt.
Yeah.
But keeping that aside, I think it's absolutely a very important issue, not only about Belgium, but about the questions around the political system in Europe in general. We have Finland, where you have the true Finns now getting traction. We have the Netherlands, we have Denmark, we have Belgium. In most of these countries, you can observe that more liberal-minded people are gaining tractions in terms of votings, and it's getting much more difficult to form stable governments. And that's something which makes somebody who is interested in history quite nervous. We had something like that before in Europe, and the outcome was not the most positive.
Yeah. Let's go to the other side of the Atlantic, in the US dollar. What is your view there of these continuing deficits and this continuing growth in the American national debt? And obviously, you know, with S&P's putting the US government on a negative watch because of credit problems or credit issues. How do you see the situation there evolving?
I think that's more a rhetorical question. The situation is quite problematic. I think everybody is aware of that, but the US has the dollar. And the dollar was the instrument to get out of these solvency problems over the last 50 years. Yeah. And I don't think anything is going to change on that. With one exception, people outside the US are getting more and more nervous about the question whether the US dollar is real the currency of their reserves. I'm quite often debating things like that with my Chinese friends. And for them it's obvious. The only result is going long silver and gold. They have a very restricted possibility in terms of their asset allocation. They can't decide the same way we can to go and put money in the equity markets in Brazil or in Indonesia. They have to stick to Chinese assets. The fixed income market is not producing positive real yields to them.
Right.
The real estate market was over the last 10 years a hole to put money into, but the smarter ones are trying to dig it out again from that. And so it's clearly a shift to precious metals, and that's something they are more and more focused on, not only because the government told them so, and because they find in every retail shop China gold positioned extremely prominent. No, that's something which fits to the Chinese style of investment.
Back in your comment about people outside the United States and their views are changing. Back in the early 1970s, President Nixon's Treasury Secretary was a gentleman by the name of John Connolly, and he made the comment during the monetary turmoil back then that the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. In other words, the U.S. is only looking domestically, and it's not really looking at what the impact of its actions are on the rest of the world, even though the dollar is the world's reserve currency. We're almost seeing that today with Mr. Bernanke, are we not? He believes that he can try to get the U.S. economy moving, and is not really seems to be paying attention to the impact that his money printing through quantitative easing is having inflationary pressures all over the world in places like China, where people cannot earn real returns on Chinese bonds. Is that a flaw in the monetary system as it exists today?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's not only the Fed. The ECB is doing more or less the same.
True.
If you look into the balance sheet of the ECB and the Fed, the trend is the same. Both of them doubled their money base over the last 3 years. The Fed is more open about that. It's a Ponzi scheme. If the national central bank is the owner of the biggest portion of the outstanding debt, I think there's no other description than that. In the end, it will end in tears. And there are, in principle, 3 possible ways to get out of this debt spiral. It's growth. You know better than me. It's quite difficult to achieve huge amount of growth in the developed countries. If we achieve potential growth, I think that already would be a success. It's about 2.5 to 3%. That's not enough to get out of the debt situation. It's a bankruptcy. Politicians are not willing to accept that, perhaps with some small countries, rather like a Lehman Brothers example, not to follow with others. And then it's inflation. And we tried to make a calculation about that. In my presentation, I have even a spreadsheet where we can play around a little bit with inflation rates and nominal and real growth rates. I think we need double-digit inflation rates and central banks keeping interest rates for governments low. And more or less the same structure you had in the 40s and 50s, where the US had an indebtedness comparable to the situation right now, but for good reason then. It was fighting the Nazis. Today they are just fighting no growth in their country. They had a good growth, on average 5 to 6% over 10 years. The government, together with the central bank, nailed the interest rates at extremely low levels. And so over 10 years time frame, they were able to get rid, at least of the spike of the debt situation.
But are the debts too big today to overcome it with growth or overcome it with a mild inflation?
Yeah,
are the debts just too huge?
Yeah, definitely. There is only a minor growth, which won't help at all. And the kind of inflation a lot of economists are debating about, 3, 4, 5%, forget about that. That's certainly not enough. And the best blueprint, I think, we already can observe in the UK. We have inflation rates, depending on which standard you are focusing in, official standards, it's between 4 and 5%. And the Bank of England has more or less no interest on their central bank rates.
Yeah.
That's a confiscation of savings, nothing else. Every year, the saver loses about 4% of its savings. And it's a redistribution to the creditor. And that's the big problem we have in our economy. The incentive structures are totally upside down. People trying to save money for financing their retirement, they are the ones who are absolutely fooled. And we have to stop that.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly on that point. I mean, the backbone of capitalism in a capitalist system is savings and production, and by far the middle class are the ones who provide that savings and that production. If they can't save, if they can't stay ahead of the curve, by earning interest on their deposits, there's a disincentive to save. You're then eroding capital, and if you lose the capital, you can't make new investment for more job growth and things of that nature. I see that as well as the biggest problem, and that's my concern about inflation, because inflation is eroding the purchasing power of the savings of the middle class.
Yeah, and of course it also takes them away the potential to educate their kids. I think that's a major issue, especially in your country, where education, decent education, is quite expensive.
Yes.
And if you take the middle class the chance away to do a proper education to their kids, that will generate a spiral which is extremely negative. And that's the reason why more and more people are losing trust in our society. We always title it's inflation based on trust deflation. And we cannot stop, and I think it would be absolutely unwise, the debates about of our clients about leaving the country physical or monetary wise. They are always wondering, where should I put my money in? It's gold and silver, yes, to some extent. We always argue between 15 and 25% physical gold and silver held outside the Eurozone. That's the core investment. But people also need some kind of return, positive cash flow. And we argue it makes sense to look for countries which are willing and able to pay back their debts. And there are only very few to find, as you certainly know.
Yeah, it would tend to be the third world countries which are experiencing good growth and good development.
Yeah, only partially so, because it's the willing. Willingness means quite solid political structure. And some of these developing countries, they are certainly able to. Russia, for example, I think would be a good example. Russia has more or less no debt, would be able to pay back all its debt given the richness of commodities they have in their soil. But do you think you are able to put such a legal status through a Moscow court?
Yeah.
I have my doubt. So for us, it's a number of 8 to 10 countries like Chile, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Canada, Singapore, Hong Kong, perhaps Finland, but starting into a transfer union, even countries like Finland are obviously not of that quality anymore. And these are all very tiny countries.
Yes.
It's not that you can put a lot of money into these markets. You have to diversify. And it's very interesting. Whenever clients come to me and argue, Philipp, can I read somewhere about the problems you are describing? I tell them, go to your Turkish neighbor here in Germany. As you perhaps know, we have a very large Turkish minority here, and they survived this hyperinflation in the 90s. They had for 12 years an average inflation rate of 50%. They know the best how to handle business, to handle savings in such a scenario. And when we start debating about bonds and life insurances, they have a big smile in their face and say, yeah, of course, these bonds and insurance contracts were paid back, but they were enough to buy a good cup of coffee.
Yeah.
You have to be in equities, you have to be in real estate, you have to be in all kind of commodities.
Tangibles or near tangibles, in the sense that an equity that's involved in commodity production or resources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we had to be in dollar or Deutschmark. That was our rescue belt. But which currency could an European or an American use for this rescue belt? Not the yen, not the pound, not the dollar, not the euro. Swiss franc, the Norwegian krona. But hey, it's absolutely not realistic. And when something like that really starts, people in Germany or in France introducing Norwegian krona or Swiss franc into their monetary system, then we will have capital controls. And so, not only triggered by the European Union to protect outflows, but also by countries like Switzerland. They don't want to have this kind of inflows into their monetary system and pump up the Swiss franc to 50 cents per euro. That's certainly also not sustainable for them.
Yeah, that's what the Swiss National Bank was trying to stop from happening last year, and they ended up taking huge foreign exchange losses. The problem is that in a world of bad economic policy, even if a country like Switzerland tries to follow good economic policy, it cannot, because there's a tidal wave of paper coming at it, and it cannot fight a tidal wave of paper. The point you're making about different countries around the world, I mean, capitalism to succeed and for people to work in the marketplace to raise their standards of living doesn't need just capital, but it also needs the rule of law, which I think was the point that you were making. And it seems that throughout the world today, the rule of law in many countries is eroding. I've seen it clearly on the other side of the Atlantic in North America, that you have the rule of men rather than the rule of law, which is really fundamentally changing the structure in which the United States operates. But the United States is not unique in that regard. It's happening in many places.
Yeah, I would oppose that argument to some extent. You are spot on regarding all the developed countries. But we have developed countries are only 19% of global population. For us, it's obvious that we always debate these countries first because they have been the most powerful during our age at
Yes.
least. But I think the world is changing. The world is changing not only in terms of economic importance, but also in the way we need to fraud our citizens or not. And I wouldn't be surprised to find a lot of the countries we describe today as emerging market countries in a much better democratic and economic situation than we are. So the wave is turning the other way around, and we have a hard time to understand and to realize, not we too, but I think we as nations, that we are not any longer the powerhouses we had been for the last 100 years. But this change is very natural. Whenever I have presentations, I often ask my audience, who do you think had been the most powerful nations and the most wealthy nations in terms of per capita GDP before the Second World War? And of course they start with the UK, with the US. The UK was not relevant at all. The US was ranked number 3, but hardly anybody comes to Uruguay or
Argentina
or Czech Republic. And there's a reason why so many Europeans migrated to countries like Uruguay and Argentina. There was wealth around. And what has left, if you look what happened to Latin America over the last 60 years, it was more or less everything bad you can imagine happening there, politically, dictatorship, economically, inflation, recessions. So within 15 years, countries, you would argue, they are so strong and prosperous, are a real economic disaster.
I can relate to that because in my own case, my own family, my grandparents, when they were deciding to emigrate from Europe to the Americas, they were, as I understand it, were undecided as to what, this is in the 1920s, whether to go to Argentina or to the United States, because at that moment in time, from a European perspective, both of them had great potential, great wealth, already had a very high standard of living. And as it turned out, they chose the United States rather than Argentina. But
lucky so.
Yeah, luckily so. But I could have been born an Argentinian instead of being born in the States. But your point about change is spot on, accurate, and I agree with it wholeheartedly. But does this also mean the international monetary system is going to change?
Yeah, absolutely.
Gold returns to its rightful role at the center of global commerce?
I doubt so. I doubt so. I would wish, of course, but I doubt, given that the allocation of gold is so disparate. Look, which are the countries who own gold today? It's the US, hopefully so. It's Germany.
Hopefully so.
Yeah, because most of it is located in the US.
Well, located in the US or loaned out. Because if you look at the Bundesbank's balance sheet, you don't really know how much is in the vaults and how much is out on loan.
Yeah, and we question the Bundesbank quite often. Where is your gold? Can you assure that it's not lended out? And they always argue, well, it's not our policy to comment on that. Italy, for example, is number 4 in terms of national gold holding, and India, China, Russia, they have hardly anything. So for me, it would be extremely unlogic that countries like them, and they are the drivers of the new currency system, would agree on a gold and silver standard. But what one could imagine is something like the Rentenmark in Germany in the 30s, that people are arguing, well, it's not necessarily gold and silver, but it has to be tangible assets.
Yes.
And your money growth has to be related to the growth of these tangible assets. And I think that's what we need to have. Money growth which is driven purely by economic growth and not by political wishes and incentive structures.
Well, that, of course, was the beauty of the Bundesbank, because it was completely separate and distinct from the political process. and the managers of the Bundesbank, were able to control the supply of money, much like Milton Friedman had recommended for so long.
Yeah.
And they were very successful at it compared to all of the other currencies out there. But we don't have the Bundesbank anymore controlling money supply. It's now in the hands of the ECB, and they seem to be more political, given the fact that they're buying government bonds. And clearly the US Federal Reserve is also political in the sense that they're funding the spending deficits of the US. You might find interesting, I was just recently in the States speaking at a monetary conference, and they reported the federal government's financial position as of the end of April. And for every $100 the US government is now spending, 40% comes from debt, only 60% comes from revenue. And historically, once you're at that 40% level, you're very, very close to hyperinflation. It shows that the market is not willing to lend to the government, and if the government doesn't cut its spending, the central bank steps in and turns that government debt into currency, which of course is exactly what happened here in the 1920s with the Reichsmark and Dr. Havenstein, who in many respects said similar things to what Mr. Bernanke is saying now, that he has to buy the government debt to prevent an economic contraction. But ultimately what it did is destroyed the currency and the economy as well.
Yeah, his argument was always, I don't have enough money. Yes. I have to print more.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a very big risk.
Mr. Bernanke is saying we don't have enough liquidity. We have to print more. It's basically saying the same thing.
You have to protect your assets. That's the central case.
Yes.
For us, we always try to find smart ideas about the solution of this debt crisis. And we now work on that for at least 2004.
Yeah.
And we haven't come up with a solution which is less problematic than the bankruptcy or the default and the war. Because that also would be, that was often a solution of a debt crisis in the past. Let's hope this is not an option at all. It's inflation. It's inflation. The problem is today politicians are even able to manipulate the inflation rates by using very creative statistics, but also like in China, just stopping companies to roll over their higher input costs. You certainly are aware about what happened to Unilever. Unilever tried to raise their prices in China by 5%, and the Chinese government told them not to do so and punished them with $250,000 for just thinking about doing it. And they clearly argued, well, we will punish you even higher if you make a second try. That's of course a major issue. And the problem is none of our citizens, no, none is wrong, but 98% of our citizens are not aware of these problems and are not interested in it.
Yeah.
It's always extremely frustrating for people being passionate by economic activity to see how few people share this interest to their best outcome. When our kids go to school, they learn a lot about languages, about math, about physics, about biology, geographics, religion, but hardly anything about economics. And I'm always wondering what's the reason? Who has an interest in keeping people stupid on economic relations?
Yeah, understood. One of the things I like to do is when people are coming to Germany, or even if they're thinking about it, I always tell them to go to Frankfurt and go to the museum at the Bundesbank.
Yep.
It's one of the best educational tools that I've ever seen, with all of the exhibits and the very detailed history, because the monetary history of Germany really has a clear examples of every possible outcome.
It's very colorful.
Yeah, it really is. They've done a wonderful job in that. So to sum up, in terms of looking at strategies, I guess there are a couple of key points. One is geographic diversification.
Absolutely right.
Tangibles or near tangibles, and education in terms of trying to understand what's going on in the monetary system today. Any other components to that, or is that the essence of it?
Being very open-minded.
Open-minded for anything that could possibly happen.
Yeah.
Philip, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to speak with you today.
Pleasure. Thank you
you.
for having me.